Key points. Rejection of India's 2019 actions in Kashmir. The recent legislative elections in Jammu and Kashmir, J&K, strongly reflected the people's rejection of India's August 2019 actions, which abrogated Article 370 and stripped J&K of its autonomy. The National Conference, NC, secured a decisive victory, with the election results signaling a setback for Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's efforts to legitimize his post-2019 policy in the region. Indian media response. Various Indian and international media outlets viewed the election result as a defeat for Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, and its attempts to assert dominance in J&K. Critics described it as a strategic and moral setback for the BJP. Backdrop of elections. The elections were held in the coercive presence of 500,000 Indian troops, with opposition leaders incarcerated or under house arrest, and severe restrictions on the media. Despite this, the result rejected the BJP's policies. Manipulation and disempowerment. The BJP had redrawn the electoral map to disempower the Muslim population, increased Jammu's representation despite Kashmir's larger population, and granted voting rights to non-Kashmiri outsiders. These moves were widely condemned in J&K. Public's response to BJP's overreach. The people's vote was seen as a referendum on BJP's actions. The NC's election campaign focused on reversing the post-2019 changes, restoring statehood, and reclaiming Article 370. BJP's failure. The BJP failed to win any seats in the Kashmir Valley, securing only 29 seats in Jammu's Hindu-majority areas. This highlighted the deepening Hindu-Muslim divide in the region. Challenges ahead for the National Conference. Omar Abdullah, poised to be the next chief minister, will lead a coalition government with Congress. However, the new government will have limited powers, facing challenges from the lieutenant governor, LG, who holds significant authority. Kashmiri sentiment and the path forward. The election result has shown that whenever given the opportunity, the people of Kashmir reject Indian rule and yearn for autonomy. However, the election does not alter J&K's disputed status as recognized by the UN Security Council. Crux. The legislative elections in Jammu and Kashmir reflect a clear rejection of India's post-2019 actions, particularly the abrogation of Article 370. Despite heavy military presence and attempts to manipulate the electorate, the people voiced their discontent with New Delhi's policies. While the victory of the National Conference signifies this rejection, the challenges of restoring statehood and autonomy under the BJP's rule remain daunting. Kashmir's status as a disputed region continues to be upheld by international resolutions. Key points. National security perspective in Pakistan. Since 1947, Pakistan's national security approach has focused on external and internal threats, perceiving hostile foreign forces and local collaborators like communists, political parties, and ethno-nationalists as threats to its security and territorial integrity. Focus on ethno-nationalists. Ethno-nationalists, such as Pakhtun and Baloch nationalists, have been seen as significant threats by the state, accused of rejecting Pakistani statehood and striving for independence or integration with neighboring states. This perception has dominated security policy. States' misreading of history. The state often wrongly assumes that ethno-nationalist movements were secessionist from the outset, ignoring that hardliners gained influence due to the state's repressive measures rather than their inherent strength. Example of Bangla nationalism. Bengali nationalism between 1947 and 1971 grew from the denial of linguistic and provincial rights. The central government's repression and refusal to honor democratic outcomes fueled secessionist sentiments, leading to the eventual creation of Bangladesh. Baloch insurgency and KP's rising tensions. Similar patterns are seen in Balochistan, where military interventions and lack of political representation have empowered hardliners. The rise of Pakhtun nationalism in KP, despite previous federal integration, shows the state's failure to address ethnic grievances. PTM's organic appeal. Movements like the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement speak to the real marginalization of populations, and the state's repressive response has only strengthened these groups. PTM's popularity reflects discontent with the state's security policies in KP. PTI's shift toward nationalism. The state's coercive measures against PTI, previously a proponent of centralized state power, have led it to adopt a more ethno-nationalist stance, showing the adverse effects of repression and denial of political mandates. States' flawed priorities. By prioritizing security and viewing the world through the lens of threats and conspiracies, the Pakistani state neglects development, human capability, and cultural fulfillment, leading to repeated conflicts with its own citizens. Crux. The article critiques Pakistan's national security approach, arguing that the state's focus on repression, centralization, and viewing ethno-nationalist movements as inherent threats has historically worsened internal tensions. Misreading history and failing to address political and ethnic grievances have led to the empowerment of hardliners in movements like the Balak insurgency and the PTM, while exacerbating conflict with its population. The state's myopic focus on security at the expense of development and human rights continues to destabilize its relations with its own people. Key points. Afghanistan re-entering U.S. focus. As the U.S. presidential elections approach, Afghanistan is returning to the spotlight due to both domestic political maneuvering and security concerns, including the recent arrest of an Afghan national in Oklahoma for planning terrorist attacks. This highlights that the U.S. is still vulnerable to threats emanating from Afghanistan. U.S. political discourse. Both Democrats and Republicans are using the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan as a political issue. Republicans criticize the Biden administration for its failure to manage the Taliban's return to power and ensure the safety of Americans and allies during the evacuation. Global and regional context. Russia is seeking to position itself as a key player in regional discussions about Afghanistan, emphasizing the need for the Taliban to control militant groups. This raises the stakes for the U.S., which cannot ignore Afghanistan's role in regional security. Pakistan's position. Pakistan is bracing for renewed U.S. interest in counterterrorism, CT cooperation due to rising militant attacks from groups like the TTP who operate from Afghan soil. The situation is dire, with August's death toll from militant attacks being the highest in 6 years. Risks of misusing counterterrorism. The article warns against Pakistan exploiting counterterrorism strategies to suppress dissent under the guise of national security. Missteps like the ban on the PTM and equating Pashtun identity with terrorism undermine the focus on genuine security threats and damage state credibility. Opportunity for change. Pakistan should embrace grassroots movements opposed to extremist violence, which advocate for peaceful protest, rule of law, and democratic rights. These movements present a viable counter-narrative to violence and could be leveraged to prevent future cycles of extremism. Crux. As Afghanistan creeps back into U.S. political discourse and security considerations, Pakistan must prepare for renewed counterterrorism cooperation. However, it should avoid the mistake of using counterterrorism as a tool to suppress legitimate dissent, particularly from groups like the PTM. Instead, Pakistan should empower grassroots movements that advocate for peace and democracy, offering them as an alternative to extremist violence. Key points. Education disparities in Pakistan. The recently launched District Education Performance Index highlights severe disparities in education across Pakistan's 134 districts, with 77 districts categorized as low performers, primarily in Balochistan and Sindh. Inequality between Islamabad and Rajanpur. A comparison between Islamabad and Rajanpur, both with similar populations of 2.3 million, reveals significant educational inequality. Islamabad ranks at the top with 84% literacy and a lower rate of children out of school. Rajanpur ranks 80th with only 37% literacy and over 50% of its children never having attended school. Systemic disadvantages. Islamabad benefits from its proximity to power, decision-makers, and resources, while Rajanpur suffers from structural discrimination and geographic marginalization, especially being distant from the provincial capital, Lahore. Flawed indicators in DBPI. Many of the 34 indicators used in the DP are beyond the control of district authorities and lie within provincial jurisdiction, such as teacher appointments, school infrastructure, and governance decisions. This calls into question the fairness of evaluating districts based on factors they cannot influence. Provincial control over district performance. Provincial governments control crucial educational resources and policies, leaving districts dependent on provincial decisions for their development and progress. DHI's focus on district performance is therefore misleading, as it often reflects provincial neglect rather than district inefficiency. Education crisis in Pakistan. Pakistan faces an education crisis, with over 25 million children out of school, and the number of illiterate individuals rising from 50 million in 1998 to 67 million in 2023. This underlines the urgent need for systemic reforms and equitable resource distribution. Crux. The DEPI highlights severe educational disparities across Pakistan's districts, but its methodology is flawed as it holds districts accountable for factors under provincial control. To truly address the education crisis, Pakistan must empower districts, reform the system, and ensure fair resource allocation, giving every child the right to quality education as enshrined in the Constitution. Key points and crux. SCO Summit in Pakistan. Pakistan is hosting the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, Heads of Government Summit, a prestigious event that highlights the country's efforts to re-engage with the international community and counter any attempts to isolate it globally. Security concerns. Due to the ongoing threat of terrorism, Islamabad and Rawalpindi have been placed under stringent security measures, with 10,000 police and paramilitary personnel deployed. The military will also assist in ensuring the safety of the summit. Diplomatic importance. The SCO, led by China, brings together key regional players like Russia, the Central Asian republics, and Iran. The forum promotes regional cooperation in economic, counterterrorism, and cultural spheres. It offers Pakistan a chance to strengthen ties with its neighbors and expand economic integration within South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Opportunity for Pakistan. The summit is an important opportunity for Pakistan to improve relations with regional states, including India. While a bilateral breakthrough between Pakistan and India is not expected, the arrival of the Indian External Affairs Minister will be closely observed. Reclaiming international standing. Once a major voice in the developing world and the Muslim world, Pakistan's international influence has diminished due to internal economic crises. Successfully hosting the SCO summit could mark the country's return to the international stage. Crux. The SCO summit provides Pakistan with a valuable platform to reconnect with regional powers and showcase its relevance on the global stage, despite security challenges. The event underscores the importance of regional cooperation for Pakistan's economic recovery, and a successful hosting could help Pakistan reclaim its international stature. Key points. Death penalty report, Justice Project. Pakistan's recent report stresses the urgent need for Pakistan to reconsider its use of the death penalty, as nearly 6,000 prisoners remain on death row. Despite a halt in execution since 2019, the number of those sentenced to death continues to rise, highlighting inefficiencies in the justice system. Psychological suffering and delays. Prisoners face prolonged periods of uncertainty, which exacerbates their psychological suffering. The report emphasizes that the death penalty does not serve justice but perpetuates despair. Regional disparities. There is significant variation in death sentences across provinces. Punjab and KP lead with the highest numbers of death row inmates, while Sindh and Balochistan have fewer. This inconsistency suggests the death penalty is applied arbitrarily, influenced by factors beyond crime severity. Mentally ill prisoners. The report highlights the inhumane treatment of mentally ill prisoners, despite rulings like Safia Bano that prohibit their execution. The case of Shiraz Butt, who died while awaiting appeal despite mental illness, exemplifies this issue. Reforms needed. Recent reforms, like abolishing the death penalty for drug offenses, are positive but insufficient. Pakistan still imposes death sentences for crimes beyond the most serious, which violates international human rights standards. Crux. Pakistan must abolish the death penalty, which fails to deter crime and undermines justice, particularly when applied inconsistently and without regard to fundamental human rights. True reform requires focusing on rehabilitation, fair trials, and safeguarding the right to life. Key points. Extrajudicial killing of Dr. Shahnawaz Kunbar. The Sindh Human Rights Commission's investigation reveals serious violations by law enforcement in the extrajudicial killing of Dr. Shahnawaz Kunbar, who was wrongfully identified as a blasphemy suspect. The inquiry found severe misconduct and a failure to follow legal protocols by police officials. Impunity and radicalization in law enforcement. There is a growing issue of radicalized officers within law enforcement acting as vigilantes, protected by a culture of impunity. These staged encounters destroy public trust in the police and contribute to the rise of mob justice. Need for accountability and reforms. The investigation calls for urgent reforms within law enforcement agencies, LEAs. There must be accountability, with rogue officers prosecuted and radical elements kept out through stringent recruitment screening. The SHRC also recommends the exhumation of Dr. Kunbar's body to investigate potential torture. Broader impact on society. The prevalence of extrajudicial killings is an indictment of the criminal justice system. If these unlawful practices continue to be accepted, society risks becoming more brutalized, and vulnerable groups may lose access to justice and constitutional rights. Crux. The extrajudicial murder of Dr. Shahnawaz Kunbar exposes deep flaws within Pakistan's law enforcement, marked by radicalization and a lack of accountability. Urgent reforms and strict accountability measures are necessary to restore public trust, prevent rogue officers from exploiting the system, and protect citizens' rights.